Passports, in the modern day, have become a tool of mandatory documentation for anyone looking to travel outside their country of birth. To some, receiving their passport symbolizes freedom and the promise of international travel. But the very necessity of owning and holding a passport is actually a severe breach of our natural right to live and travel wherever we please. For the majority of recorded history, the freedom to live and travel wherever we wished was viewed as an unalienable human right. The first vestiges of what would become the modern-day passport began in 1500 BC Egypt, where visitors were required to have permission documents before leaving port. Over the next couple millennia, travel documents were used off and on in certain cultures for various political or economic reasons, but never became a fixed or worldwide phenomenon until the last century. During the early Middle Ages, foreign travel to and from England was only allowed for those issued a special king's license, until in 1215 this system was upended by the Magna Carta, which decreed that anyone, except criminals, could leave the country freely, with a clause stating, quote, "It shall be lawful in future for anyone to leave our kingdom, and to return, safe and sound, by land and by water." This level of freedom of movement lasted for a few hundred years, until 1540, when the Crown once again began requiring permission to travel through government-issued passports. During the 1600s, English laborers were required to hold locally issued passes to travel for work, made to stop them from benefits shopping. And by the time of the American Revolution, the right of travel was woven into common law, seen as a fundamental freedom. The Articles of Confederation, signed in 1777, stated that citizens of all states would have, quote, "free ingress and regress to and from any other state." Meanwhile, in Europe, an individual's nationality had little meaning before the late 1700s, making such documentation superfluous in most cases, until the French Revolution started in 1789. During the height of the Revolution, the National Assembly proclaimed that one of the natural rights of a citizen was the freedom to wander at will. This lasted only 3 years, however, and in 1792 the National Assembly completely changed their tune, drafting up several severe travel controls and passport procedures. This began by requiring all citizens to carry passes for controlling internal movement, especially to Paris, but after the king tried to escape and foreign aristocrats attacked the revolution, the authorities began requiring mandatory papers for all entry to and exit from the country. This revolution created one of the world's first nation-states, defined by the national identity of its people rather than claims from the crown, making identity papers integral to creating the modern state. In their wake, many other European countries began requiring passports and installed their own systems of travel controls, especially for monitoring travel to and from the French epicenter of rebellion. During the next century, however, with the growth of railways and steamships, and the blossoming of a middle class, emigration into America increased tremendously, and the administrative systems of most nations could no longer keep up with the steadily growing number of travelers. The result was that by the turn of the 20th century, most American states and European nations had once again stopped issuing passports entirely. During this time, there was a powerful group of activists within business and government who viewed passports as a hindrance to commercial interests, and for a time successfully lobbied for the abolition of all passports. The British Foreign Secretary, Earl Granville, even wrote at the time, quote, "All foreigners have the unrestricted right of entrance into and residence in this country." Unfortunately, the outbreak of World War I upended this short-lived period of worldwide freedom, one that has never returned since. The First World War changed the world's political landscape immensely, causing all European nations to reinstitute passport regulations and identity documents to curtail the operation of enemy spies. In the 1920s, after the war ended, the League of Nations met to decide how best to deal with international travel administration. Talks began with debates about totally abolishing passports, supported by a strong anti-passport lobby, but eventually the end result of the conferences went completely the other direction, and to deal with the large numbers of displaced people in post-war Europe, increased standardization of travel documents and a system for issuing passports to stateless refugees was instituted worldwide. Martin Lloyd explains in his book The Passport, when peacetime came, governments, and particularly the secret services, were not keen to relax passport requirements back to pre-war levels, having, quote, discovered how closely a population could be controlled. Governments also didn't want to give up the immense revenue generated by charging fees for passports and visas, resulting in further standardization and mechanization of passport controls throughout the next decades. During the Great Depression, police and guardsmen sometimes even blocked American citizens trying to cross state lines looking for work. When World War II began, passport regulation was further strengthened when the United States instituted new laws declared under national emergency. Then, in the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, President Truman signed an emergency proclamation, later renewed during the Korean War, which still remains in effect today, granting the strictest passport controls in history. This policy of mandatory modern passports has been carried out for decades now on the basis of national emergency powers that have quietly gone uncontested for too long. Such an essential freedom as our right to travel and live where we please should be much more straightforward in our legal system than this current version being enforced by an outdated and unrepealed Emergency Act. When asked about this, the Passport Office of the Department of State has simply said, quote, the presidential proclamation and the regulations issued pursuant thereto are still in effect. Yes, but should they be? What business does the government have in restricting our natural right to freedom of movement? Why should emergency powers issued during wartime be extended indefinitely? The reason is because governments have discovered a highly effective way of monitoring, taxing, and restricting the movement of their citizens. With modern technology like RFID and biometrics being added to passports, governments have found a system of controlling their populations too effective to give up. Now, everyone in the world is required to carry a passport in order to travel anywhere outside their country of birth. Highly restrictive visas prevent many from entering or living in certain areas. The American Passport Office states, quote, it is an international fact of life that most foreign countries require an alien to have a passport in his possession in order to enter the country. As a matter of fact, you are required to present a passport to register in the hotels of most foreign countries. Most persons who have studied the international documentary requirements are of the opinion that passports will be required by most countries in the foreseeable future. Passports have become a way for governments to tax and track us, similar to how baggage tags are used on our suitcases. The current regulations are being enforced by an emergency presidential proclamation that has flown under the radar for decades. With modern technology becoming more integrated, the amount of intrusion and control instituted by such a system has reached Orwellian levels, with more, not less, regulations constantly being implemented. This trend towards tyranny and away from freedom will continue until people realize and start speaking out against this growing problem. The cliché wartime request for "papers, please," once a statement epitomizing tyrannical overreach of government control, is now a modern standard the world over. Please like, comment, and share if you agree that passports and visas, at least in their current form, should be abolished and our worldwide natural right to international travel restored.